Good evening. Welcome to another reading of Edgar Allan Poe. But tonight, we're going to be talking a little bit about his life. And we all thought, wow, what kind of mind would come up with these stories? Let's talk about some of his life. I'll be reading some of that to you tonight. And it's not what you think. It's good to see everybody. Tommy, Peg, Bill, Grateful is with us. Thea, Elizabeth, Lover, Cosmo, King Kong, Jason, Jimmy King. It's good to have everybody here. Quoth the Raven, sweet Fanny Adams. It's probably from that era, I would imagine, right? So tonight, I am wearing what they call a grandfather or a grandpa shirt. It is a very low collar. Some people call them a Mandarin collar, a very short collar. It's perfect for someone who has a bigger beard, so the collar isn't always like messing with the beard. This is made out of Irish linen. Maybe one of the most comfortable shirts I have. I like wearing it with a vest. It's a very, for lack of a better term, it's very 19th century. And I'm not even sure that this hat would be appropriate to be wearing with a period type of outfit like this. This shirt has a lot of buttons. Some are really close together, all the way down, and then they get further apart towards the bottom. But when you look at the shirt underneath, I don't know if you can see that, you can see the collar. Very short. Doesn't come up on the neck at all. It's not a shirt that you would wear to keep warm. It's the kind of shirt that a grandfather in the 1800s and early 1900s would wear. Possibly one of the most comfortable shirts that I have. Just, I can't even begin to tell you how comfortable this thing is. It just fits perfect. And wearing it with a wool vest that I really enjoy. And I used to wear this vest quite a bit and wear it with a pocket watch. And it kind of fits. So this would be more of a kind of a poor European outfit. This would have been considered a like dressing up in the 1800s for the common man. And of course the flat cap, or as my oldest son would call the Italian cap. It is this is all wool. It is a Ralph Lauren Chaps hat. I like it. And I tend to like these hats like a little tilted towards the left eye. That's just kind of like, rather than perfectly symmetrical, I like it down. I pull it down a little bit further like this. So I like it a little bit at an angle, but not so much like a beret kind of thing. It does have a kind of a brim on it. You can see that. But it's not raised in the front like the Greek fisherman hats. I'm not real crazy about that look. So again, like when I put this on, when I wear this out and about, it's really just to keep the top of your dome warm, and then just pull it down over your left eye a little bit like that. And it really just works well with a beard and the short grandpa collared shirt, which almost looks kind of like pajamas, that kind of look, but a very thick cotton linen. This thing has more buttons on it than you can imagine. And I wouldn't wear it with anything except a vest. Could I wear it by itself? I would wear it by itself with a pair of kind of like a baggy pair of khakis. No pleats, just kind of a plain front. And that would be the look of a commoner in the 1800s. So it's not a newsboy. This is not a newsboy cap, although from the perspective that you're seeing it, you can see where it could be almost like that. Get the side view of it. So we're going to read tonight a little bit about the life of Edgar Allan Poe. We've done a lot of Poe reading. And let me just start. It's good to see everybody tonight. This book that I'm reading, the copyright date, as we talked about, is 1956. Here we go, talking about Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was born in 1809 and died in 1849, which makes him how old when he died? Pop quiz. Somebody tell me, how old was he when he died? Many Balkan men from Greece, Turkey, Serbia, and Albania wear a similar hat. They do. Yep. He was 40 years old when he died. Very young man. Very young man. In that brief lifespan of 40 years, he initiated enough half-truths and legends to grant later biographers and indiscreet analysts the apparent license to make the man into a repulsive myth. So the things that you think about Edgar Allan Poe, he achieved exactly what he wanted. He wanted you to think he was crazy. He wanted you to think that he was off his rocker. He wanted you to think that he wasn't just a creative, but that his literature was coming from a corrupt, kind of evil, disturbed mind. Mission accomplished, right? Mission accomplished, because that's what we all think. Poe was a drunkard. Poe was a dope fiend. Poe was an amorous reprobate. These are among the roll call of sins which had made him a delight to minds easily horrified by human weakness and have been the despair of critic and scholar to destroy. He did it all on purpose. He was much more together than you might think. The misunderstanding which has given rise for more than a century to the Poe myth comes from several sources and stimuli. The first is the obvious human failing to confuse life and literature, to assume, in other words, that what a man wrote, he inevitably was in his own person. Right? We've all said that. We've all thought to ourselves, wow, what kind of mind did all these stories come out of? Man, he must have been messed up. Mission accomplished. Admittedly, Poe is at fault in the creation and encouragement of this myth making. He falsified his own age. He invented the story that he had been to Greece and he'd fought for Greek independence, this to escape the imputation of disgrace that a Southern gentleman had served as an enlisted man in the United States Army. He affected poses and manners and made profound impressions on easily impressionable ladies. These and other details which might be added were the weaknesses of a man who could be vain and silly, but they seem to raise the whole question of truth in Poe, the man, and in his writings, and they tended to grant permission for many readers to read straight into the person of Poe, with all the diabolism and horror of the poems and tales. Many people enjoy human interest, and the slide rule of interest can move in either direction. From the tales, one can go directly to the presumed horrific in Poe, and from the terror ridden in the man Poe, one can embroider and exaggerate the writings. The two, life and literature, act as stimulants on each other and end by totally falsifying the man and his art. He purposely misrepresented himself. That was part of the aura that he created that I believe helped sell him. How many people do that? How many people, like when someone says that person is crazy, and or someone calls you crazy, what do? You instantly disagree. You instantly start to defend yourself. He never did. When people said he's crazy, there's something going on in his head that's not going on in the heads of other people. He didn't defend that. He didn't try to change their minds. He let them think that. This was the brilliance of Poe. One would like for all time to destroy the fictions that Poe was a drunkard. He couldn't drink. Owing to a curious but well-known nervous sensibility, one drink of wine or whiskey made him senseless. He was allergic to alcohol. We might say, well, he can't handle his liquor. Edgar Allan Poe could not handle his liquor. Literally. He was not a dope fiend. Only once in a life did he take a laudanum to calm his nerves, and then he became violently ill. He couldn't take substances. He couldn't drink alcohol. He was not a rake. His life was, in fact, one of the dullest any figure of literary importance has lived in the past 200 years. This was all made up. This is 100% made up. Yet legends die hard or never die at all. And the total Poe legend has been kept alive both by the interest and suspicion which the person of Edgar Poe has sustained, and by the literary importance which his writings have obtained since his death. He became the Poe that we know after he died. While he was living, people did not have these opinions about him. It was after. It was the legend, the myth, the Poe myth. Poe has been a kind of American phenomenon, or a freak, who ever since he published The Raven in 1845 has had an enormous popularity in two quite distinct quarters. He has been well known to thousands of ordinary people who ever since they were in grade school have had the casual acquaintance with his poems and tales, and he has been admired by the French and other continental writers and critics of great astuteness and celebrity. Was he crazy like a fox? That's what I ask you. Was he crazy like a fox? If you were at a gathering and you came away with the opinion there's something wrong with that man, he was so sure and so confident of himself that he allowed you to think that about him. Was it a marketing ploy to sell his work? Literature from a madman. A writer should not have such a fortunate condition. Either we are told he should be a writer popular among the ordinary readers and sneered at by the intellectuals, or he should be the special darling of the intellectuals and ignored by the masses and the average. In America, Longfellow is a good example of the first, and Whitman of the second conditions. Yet one wonders how much of the Poe myth and the Poe legend have been kept alive by his supposedly horrendous private life and by critical nonsense, such as that perpetrated by Baudelaire, that Poe was the artist tragically misplaced in an unartistic, loutish democratic society. Either program can inflate a reputation and do great damage to the man and his writings. Despite the fact that Poe has been the object of the most careful and mature study by scholars and critics, no other major and mature study by scholars and critics alike, no other major American writer has been so well analyzed and exposed. The case of Poe is nonetheless shrouded in mystery and half-truths and foolishness. He was America's major poet before the coming of Walt Whitman. Remember the poems that I read to you? Incredible. His poems involve your body, not just your mind, your body. You can't help get into a rhythm when you read his poems. You can't help but escalate and accelerate your speech as you read his poems. And yet his poetry is today considered noise and nonsense. Along with Hawthorne, he virtually invented the modern short story. Yet, with several exceptions, his 70 tales are written off as clever tricks or sly deceptions to shock the unsuspecting. His one attempt to write a novel, called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, had been generally regarded either as a hoax, which fooled no one, or a tedious exploitation of the popular interest in South Polar exploration. Generally speaking, his criticism still commands respect, but recent critical theory has moved far from Poe's attempts at making psychology of artistic creation, and from his assertions that there can be devised rules for art as cogent and logical as the rules of science. Yet the French and some of the English still think very well of Poe. After admitting his uneasy place in America, one wonders why he should still so much be admired. Mr. T.S. Eliot had stated that the French regard Poe's verse and prose so highly because the translations they read are better than the originals. Mr. Alan Tate has suggested that Poe is our cousin who reminds us uncomfortably of some of the deepest longings we all possess, but of which we are too ashamed to admit, even to ourselves. Poe, in short, acted out for us our own childish, arrogant, violent inner world, which, because we are civilized people, we all keep under control. He revealed that which is in you. He took your propensity for craziness and violence, yours, and put it into stories and poetry. Poe has done for us what we wouldn't dare do for ourselves. How many of us defend ourselves against accusations? Right? How much effort do we, somebody does a hit video about somebody on YouTube, and then next thing you know, there's a response video. If Poe was alive today and people did hit videos about him, which are so popular on YouTube, think about this. He allowed people to do that. He did not defend himself. These are some of the shifting and uneasy determinants of Poe in our time. We cannot destroy a century's accretion of legends and half-truths. We cannot even begin to settle or judge the case of Poe. The best we can do is to look at the writings and decide for ourselves what they say and mean. We can best take them in the order as a group of works in which they appear in all his books. Poe began as a poet, and there we may well begin too. For him, he said, poetry was a passion, and no doubt it was. But there is more to it than mere passion. We are at liberty to look into or behind it for what made that poetry the curious and baffling expression that it was. For one thing, Poe's poetry is essentially the poetry of a very young man. The bulk of it was written by the time Poe was 22 years old. Although there are a few poems scattered through the tales and in the periodicals between 1831 and 1835, only in the last 4 years of his life, after the publication of The Raven, did Poe return to the composition of poetry. Within that 4-year span of the last years came such acknowledged masterpieces as The Raven, Ulalume, For Annie, Annabel Lee, The Bells, yet much of that later verse was occasional or addressed to certain ladies by a forlorn widower who wanted to marry again. Holy cow. How interesting. Poe wanted to marry again. He was a broken man, a hurt man, a confused man because of death of loved ones. We read it last night in A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. Remember the first words in that book, which I thought were powerful. No one ever told me that grief felt like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same flutter in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I keep swallowing. At times I feel mildly drunk or have a concussion. There's an invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me. C.S. Lewis. Now, is there a relationship between Edgar Allan Poe and C.S. Lewis? C.S. Lewis grieved. And we only see it once. We only see it once in A Grief Observed. Everything else, could it have been could C.S. Lewis's writings really be an allegory or just a literary metaphor of his own life? Are you seeing the similarities between Poe and Lewis? The Raven, did Poe return to the composition of poetry within the 4-year span? The last years came such acknowledged masterpieces as The Raven, Ulalume, For Annie, Annabel Lee, The Bells. They suggest that Poe had virtually abandoned poetry as a serious expression. The reason for such a sensation might be that poetry did not make money, and short stories could earn a few dollars, or that the pressures of a grinding, poverty-ridden existence kept Poe from directing his best efforts into the writing of poetry. We may be able to suggest deeper reasons for that declining output after 1831, Poe's 23rd year. It is important to consider for the present what, for Poe, poetry really was and what its purposes were. What was the purpose of The Raven? What was the purpose of Lenore? What is the purpose of Annabel Lee? What is the purpose of his poetry? Both the sonnet To Science and Israfel tell us what Poe thought poetry ought to be. The first named poem is not, as it is so frequently interpreted, a complaint that science destroys the beautiful myths of antiquity and substitutes man's ruthless analysis of nature. It is an assertion, as is Israfel and the later philosophy of composition, that poetry is not in any way like science, philosophy, logic, or any other exercise of the human mind. Poetry is itself a way of learning. It in no way employs the methods of logical positivistic investigation. It acts only as poetry. And what it reduces to order or brings into the range of comprehension is rendered only poetically. Think about this. Didn't Freud say sometimes a cigar is just a cigar? That's the first thing that came to my mind. I could hear Poe saying, sometimes poetry is just poetry. It doesn't have to mean anything. I'm writing it to create a reaction in you. Like certain critics of his own time and of our own, Poe had early abandoned the forlorn hope that poetry described or spoke to, or in any way reported the world which is presumed real. Poetry was quite simply poetry, and it had its own rules. An excuse for being, and it was not moral teaching, nor excitement, nor personal uplift, nor truth. It was, in Poe's terms, a complex journey of the mind from some supposed here to some indeterminate presumed there. His poetry took you from here to there. That's what it did. It was a different mind journey every time. A mind journey. Some people would say a mind trip or a mind F. It was a mind journey. Poe was manipulating you on purpose. It was a different mind journey every time it was undertaken, or every time a poem was written or read. Sometimes the imagination moved toward a comprehension of death or of human love, or a profound sense of the past, or of the mind's witnessing of its own despair and loss of sanity. Ooh, did you catch that? If for one moment that you thought that this man was losing his mind, ding, mission accomplished. He succeeded. Poetry was the one instrumentality of man, and the only one which could go through and beyond the world of brute fact and enter into the world of pure mind, or what Poe termed ideality. Thus, Poe's poetry is difficult because it does not do or say what readers of poetry expect poetry to say and do. If you read The Raven after the first time I read it to you, and then I posted it on my YouTube community page, if you read it and you mumbled the words under your lips, you felt it. Poe was attempting to break down two obstructions both to the creation and to the understanding of poetry. One was the generally held view that poetry was a moral or didactic and had meaning applicable to everyday lives of men and women. He broke that myth that poetry is trying to teach you something. Sometimes he says he thought poetry was just in the moment. Once the generally held view that poetry was moral or didactic and had meaning applicable to the everyday lives of men and women. Thus, he made his forthright and sometimes vitriolic attacks on Longfellow, the laureate of the moral and of the immediately understandable in poetry. The other misconception was that poetry can exist as a pretty word spinning, that it helps draw fresh or startling connections between things and ideas, that it makes us read the world anew. Poetry, for Poe, this is key, was one of the oldest and surest ways man had so far discovered whereby he might leave the flux and meaninglessness of daily existence and penetrate to the world of essence, pure idea, of order. All the sciences and otherwise rational expressions of man deal with the world of disorder. Poetry is man's single comprehension of design and order, and it is nothing else but poetry. Like I had said, quoting Freud, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Poetry is man's single comprehension of design and order and nothing else. It's nothing else but poetry. If indeed there by any one circle of thought distinctly and palpably marked from amid the jarring and tumultuous chaos of human intelligence, Poe wrote in the Drake Halleck Review, it is that evergreen and radiant paradise which the true poet knows, and knows alone, as the limited realm of his authority. Poe's poems seem therefore ephemeral, shapeless, or confused in their imagery, and lacking in the solidities of thought because they are concerned not with statements about or projections of thought, but with aesthetic and poetic approaches to thought. There is, for example, a vast difference between simply informing or convincing someone that death is everywhere and conveying the difficult, complex way by which one comes to an apprehension of that thought. One is prose, one is poetry. Poe succeeded at blurring the line between poetry and prose. Or is it one thing to state that the present is formed from the past, and another to show vividly that the past is a vital, breathing element in the very present, as Poe does in his work The City and the Sea? A poem should not only approach to an idea, but also the feelings of that idea. Poe was a genius. Think about anyone who's ever been in sales training. If you've been in sales training, you know that people purchase not with their intellect, they purchase with their emotions. Then they use their intellect to justify their purchase after. It was a mind journey. Poe was consequently one of the first poet critics to be interested in the psychology of poetry. Poetry, pun intended there. And by psychology, we mean what happens to both the poem and to the reader when the poem has something quite distinct from the poet who wrote it slowly releases its meaning. The equation of poem and reader is forever new and different every time it occurs. Poetry was, for Poe, a tentatively charted way toward an understanding of man and his world, which was non-rational and intuitive, and understanding of madness, passionate love, evil, the past, the present, and even death. If anything, poetry is religious because it deals with the soul. Yet by virtue of trying to say more than words can convey, and by concerning itself with the vision which opens to the religious quest for understanding, Poe's poetry was necessarily incomplete. It could not force words, bound to the world of sense and existence, to convey an apprehension of the spirit, the absolute, the ideal. It could not fulfill its purposes and eventually failed. One might tentatively suggest reasons for that failure. By regarding the poem as a journey of the imagination or the soul, from the known to the unknown, Poe demanded of poetry more than it should have to perform. Wow. Poe demanded of poetry more than it should have had to perform. Some of the poems are virtually meaningless, such as Fairyland, because they were designed to reach toward and even arrive at meanings which words, thus far in the evolution of language, cannot state or make known. The condition is one wherein there is an idea to be comprehended, but no symbol or discourse at hand capable of expressing it, as if the mathematician did not have the word or symbol for infinity or for the square root of -1, and the best he could do was employ a set of intricate, suggestive circumlocutions. You know that word? Poe's best poems, on the contrary, are those which, like To Helen and The Raven, have a meaning contained and fulfilled in the poem. No need to look beyond. It is what it is. To Helen displays its meaning only in image and suggestion, yet its three stanzas reduced to poetic order, a set of intuitive ideas about the ancient world of Greece and Rome. The Raven is not only about a young man grieving for his lost Lenore, it is even more strikingly about a young man whose grief is turned into madness under the steady one-word repetition of the talking bird. The poem is therefore a demonstration not only that a mind can go to pieces under the impact of a non-rational external agency, but what is even more horrifying, that the mind can watch itself in the very process of going mad. The mind can watch itself in the process of going mad. We can posit a second determinant for Poe's poetic failure, or for his virtual abandonment of poetry. His poetry demonstrates a split between feelings and thoughts. His poetry demonstrates a split between the feelings that he had that came as a result of his thoughts. He tried to write poetry of feeling which would contain not mere feeling, but even a thought about that feeling. And then a feeling about that thought, or the idea of a feeling. Yet, as his later comments show, he was ashamed of the very feelings which had presumably brought the poetry into existence. Once he had lost those emotions or found them insufficient, he could no longer write poetry. He didn't even believe that every feeling was fit material for poetry. There were only a few emotions or subjects which justified the poetic energy and expression. The rest might just as well be consigned to the lower range of prose. Having such an exalted view of what poetry was or should be, Poe consistently tried to throw over or around the subject for poetry a solid weight of thought. In short, the emotion, the idea, or the subject initially there for poetic expression, it wasn't enough. So something had to be done with it. His later comments, such as the preface to The Raven, are open confessions that he was ashamed of his youthful feelings. In the poem Tamerlane, I saw thee on thy bridal day, and in other poems of 1827, Poe celebrated his lost love for Sarah Royster, but the emotion was not pure. These poems, Tamerlane especially, forced the emotion to masquerade behind poses of ironic detachment or of high intellectuality, which are not really germane to the poems at all. The poems of emotion are imperfect and incomplete because they sought to elude or escape from the very subject they professed to expose. Thought tried to run away with feeling. Whoa, that was deep. Thought tried to run away with feeling. The same situation or fracture is strikingly apparent in Ulalume, a poem of Poe's later years. Poe had a valid subject for a poem, his grief after the death of his wife, Virginia, and the poem narrates one of Poe's night walks, this one on All Souls' Eve, where he went and visited Virginia's grave. But the subject of grief or longing was insufficient to make a poem. Poe involves that theme in an elaborate fantasy of geographical and astronomical learning. This once I reach the legended tomb suddenly collapses when the protagonist realizes that he can never forget the dead first wife in a marriage to a second. Ulalume is one of the most confusing poems in the language because, though he had a highly emotional subject, Poe sought every means to conceal the basic subject behind a parade of learning and abstruse reference. In making a split between emotion and thought, he virtually destroyed the poem. Other poems, such as Al-Araf, are learned. That is, they contain knowledge of a rather special and difficult kind. But the fault with them is not so much the amount of learning they contain as that the learning remained merely learning and did not somehow become translated or transmuted into poetry. From first to last, Poe did not think hard or well enough as a poet. He was, in his way, capable of quite profound feeling and thought, but he made them separate functions and he could not think and feel at the same time. In short, he was not able to be a poet with his whole being. He was by turns lyrical, dramatic, musical, meditative, even expository, and he made the nearly fatal error of thinking that he could make a science of poetry. There is some justice in the charge that Poe's poetry sought spectacular effects rather than be simply poems. In turning about 1832 from poetry to the short story, Poe did not stop being a poet. A shift from one expression to another may sometimes be disastrous, or, as in the case of Poe, may lead to even fuller and greater expression. Poe turned to the writing of short stories because he needed to make money, he discovered, perhaps all unaware even to himself, and that poetry could not fulfill the high aims he had for it. Eventually, the short story served Poe that office of necessary expression. It became a way for him of ordering an otherwise chaotic world. It also became a poem in its projection of some of those deepest impulses which had animated him as a poet, but which, now that he had become more mature as a man and as an artist, Poe could delineate without the masquerade or the apparent embarrassment of his earlier years. His beginnings as a short story writer are the most unusual in the records of literature. He started by lampooning the standard best-selling tales of the day. He won a prize of $100 for his MS, Found in a Bottle, a tale in which he outspoofed his contemporaries who regularly produced tales of mysterious ciphers. In his book, Metzengerstein, Poe's first published tale, and the first in this collection, is a fantasy which out-fantasies the German tale of terror with its Baroque setting, its titanic villain, and its overwrought prose, which had come down as a staple of popular reading from the Gothic romances of the 18th century. Again, in the Assignation, the second tale in his collection, is not to be taken with any degree of seriousness. A hot-eyed Byronic tragedy is played against the backdrop and even the canals of Venice, and the assignation, which can occur only in the death of lovers separated in life, underlines Poe's artful jesting with the agony tale of his, or even our, own time. What Poe soon discovered was that even in the most outrageous grotesquerie, he could write better short stories than could most productive and popular contemporaries. His short story writing career began with his burlesquing almost every best-selling tale there was. Brilliant. The tale of terror, of mystery, of the Orient, passion, and ended with his own conviction that the art form he had begun by ridiculing was, after all, as serious, purposeful, and distinguished as the poem, the drama, the novel, or any other imaginative expression. He initiated his short story career in the turgid nonsense of Metzengerstein and the equally turgid passion of the assignation, and ended with the mordant commentary on human mortality in The Black Cat and Hopfrog. For purposes of convenience and clarity, we might well confine our inquiry into Poe's short stories into two divisions: those which deal with the states of mind in its consciousness or subconscious condition, and those which consider the problem of art, the artist, and the world of the imagination in art. There may be subtopics, but they will turn on these two formulations. A tale, his tales, his short stories, were like a poem. They didn't deal with ordinary life. Its range was the limitless reach of the imagination into the mysteries of existence. One great mystery of life was the deep abyss of subconscious mental activity which lies beneath the otherwise placid surface of normal existence. Poe assumed in his tales one crucial condition. This is brilliant. Every mind is either half mad or capable of easily slipping into madness. He was not so much concerned with precisely what madness was, but with the conditions and stages whereby madness came to exist and evidenced itself in otherwise average, commonplace human beings. Therefore, he presented a number of protagonists who would not only go mad, but who would, all the while, be aware that they were going mad. This introspective habit and self-knowledge would make all the more believable and horrible the stages of mental disintegration. A number of tales treat these highly gifted men who can see and analyze their own inner world of terror. In the story Ligeia, the narrator has such an obsession for his dead first wife that he cannot see his second wife, the Lady Rowena, except in the guise of Ligeia. But more than that, even the whole of his world and vision are so refracted through the eyes of Ligeia. Notice how he keeps insisting on the lady's eyes. Where did we see a focusing and an obsession about eyes? Where did we see that? What caused the man in Telltale Heart to murder the old man who was staying with him? What was it? His eyes. Was Poe obsessed with eyes? Poe keeps insisting on the lady's eyes that he has no sense of reality at all except as he knows it from her. One of the special interests in The Fall of the House of Usher is that Roderick Usher knows at every turn the extent of his own disintegrating mind, his twin sister, a part of him, tries to destroy because her removal might free him from the pain of physical life. But he knows that as soon as she dies, he dies too. Thus he tries to bury her alive. Usher is privileged to watch the corruption of his own mind, yet see that disintegration objectified in the house. In the literature he reads, or has read to him, in his own physical being, Poe puts between us and Usher a narrator, a third person who, like us, comes slowly to know the elements in this tragedy of mind. The collapse of the house is the ultimate annihilation of a being that was Roderick Usher. Here's some interesting comments. William Wilson, the story William Wilson, approaches this theme from a slightly different point of view. Here, the mind of Wilson refuses to acknowledge what it really is until it is totally disintegrated. The excellence of this story is that we, not Wilson, witness and are at every stage aware of the interior drama. A similar drama is externalized in The Oval Portrait, which I read to you several days ago. A psychic condition as though it could occur prophetically in a picture rather than actually in the human mind. So too, the Telltale Heart attempts to present exteriorly the internal disintegration where the whole world becomes an illusion of evil, with its pulse synchronous with the heartbeat of the miserable sufferer. The Black Cat Is all of these tales perhaps the most incisive inquiry into the capacity of the human mind both to originate and to speculate on its own destruction? I'm going to have to read that probably in the next couple days, The Black Cat. Finally, the imp of the perverse, more of an allegory than a tale, is Poe's rationale that to indulge for a moment in any attempt at thought is to be inevitably lost. These tales, as well as others that might be mentioned, turn on the central theme that if the human mind were incapable of thought, it would be healthy and alive, since it is a mind and does have the power of introspection, that when very power and knowledge spell its death. Thought is what constitutes a mind, but the act of thinking can be death to the mind. Our second consideration is Poe's long preoccupation and obsession with the design of the short story. For him, form and idea were inseparable. What the idea was so would be the design. Throughout his whole short story writing career, Poe sought for improved ways of expression. In the review of Hawthorne's Twice Told Tales, he even dared to formulate a set of precise rules on what a story had to be. Technique and concept blended for the short story, if properly ordered in all its parts, might be the way of the imagination, both of the writer and the reader, to come to a new understanding, very much like the new perceptions that can be known in poetry. In its way, a short story is like a poem. It is particularly not about an action or a human situation, despite all the frenzy and sensationalism Poe wove into his action. It was the special, almost unique way whereby the action or situation is presented and understood. In its composition, the writer engaged himself in a process moving towards an ordered comprehension of an idea. In its reading, the story is not something made by the artist. It is itself a separate entity, neither didactic nor the author's private biography, but capable of ordering and controlling the imaginative response of the reader. It contains, as Poe himself said, everything necessary to its explanation and understanding. It would be an exercise or journey of the responding imagination, different every time it occurred. Yet it should be, Poe maintained, reducible to a certain known laws of art and of the human mind. In such a way, Poe became one of the first modern symbolists. Symbolism was not merely one way, but an infinitely variable means of presenting ideas and meanings. Meaning and form were elaborately complex. The way the human mind made things known to itself. We might consider how, in representative short stories, the implications and meanings are projected in the very design itself. I'm so thoroughly enjoying this. I just don't want to bore you. Despite its seemingly disorganization, Poe was one of the first to see clearly the double danger of the artist. In a modern democratic society which seems to have little use for him, but which is only too happy to accept and reward him when he does something that pleases, Poe himself was ignored and hailed, both responses convinced him that art or poetry had little to do with the condition of the artist. Despite the disorganization, Poe's career is curiously a piece. What he discovered in his own writing, whether poetry or short story, he sought to substantiate in his criticism and theory of art, and what he deduced as theory he sometimes directed towards his explorations into the further ranges of artistic discovery and communication. The man Poe has been for 100 years, the victim of pity, sentimentality, condemnation, in our day is the object of all three together. He arouses so much heat and debate because he is still a mind to reckon with. He was instrumental in founding the modern short story, and he was in the forefront of aesthetic and critical debates on the nature of the autonomy of art itself. Poe was instrumental in creating the modern short story. The timeline of his life: 1809, born in Boston, second son of David and Elizabeth Arnold Poe. They were professional actors. 1811, Mrs. Poe died in Richmond, Virginia. Poe taken as a foster child into the home of John and Frances Keeling Allan, a prosperous Richmond household. Allan never adopted Poe. In 1815, the Allans in England, Poe attended the Manor House School conducted by the Reverend John Bransby at Stoke Newington near London. In 1826, he entered the University of Virginia in February. Despite his excellent scholastic record, he was forced to withdraw because John Allan refused to pay his gambling debts. 1827, Poe learned that his young fiancée, Sarah Elmira Royster, was forced by her family into a marriage with Mr. Shelton. He quarreled with Allan, left home in March, and went to Boston. There he published Tamerlane and other poems, enlisted in the army in May as Edgar A. Perry, and was sent to Fort Moultrie in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. 1829, Poe rose to regimental sergeant. He was discharged from the Army in 1829. In December, he published in Baltimore Tamerlane and Minor Poems. In 1830, he secured an appointment as a cadet at West Point. Pretty wild. He was discharged in 1831 and then published Poems, second edition. In 1837, he published 5 tales in the Philadelphia Saturday Courier. Generally, he was in desperate circumstances in Baltimore. In December of 1835, he became the editor of Southern Literary Messenger magazine in Richmond, and in May 1836, he was married to his cousin, Virginia Clem. 1839, he resigned from the Messenger. He published the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. He moved to Philadelphia, became the editor of Burton's Gentleman's Magazine from 1839 to June 1840. In 1841, he became the editor of Graham's Magazine, and then tried to found a magazine on his own in April 1844. He moved to New York, supported himself and the ailing Virginia by doing hack work for the New York Evening Mirror and other periodicals. In 1845, The Raven published in the Evening Mirror, and overnight, Poe became famous. He began work on and then became editor of the Broadway Journal and moved among the New York literati, published The Raven and other poems in November. In 1847, Virginia died. Poe had sentimental relations with several ladies, addressed verses to them, and was even engaged to Mrs. Sarah Helen Whitman, but the marriage plans were broken off in December of 1848. He lectured in various places. In July 1849, he went to Richmond, met again the now widowed Sarah Royster, and he became engaged to her. On his return to New York to arrange his affairs, he died October 7th under mysterious circumstances in Baltimore. What a life, right? What a life. Now you know a little bit about Poe. Yes, he was a troll. He was a troll. He would be on Twitter today making fun of people just to get them to respond. But the raven made him popular overnight. What does it say about the world at that time that the raven became popular? I'm not looking for an answer, but just a kind of I pose the question: why in the world did the raven become the most popular piece of literature at the time? I don't know. I got to think about that. Jimmy King says so eloquently, when someone informs you that you are not normal, consider it a compliment and thank them for it. Somebody has had to do a song about the raven somewhere. Somebody had to, right? I don't know who would have done it. I'm trying to think of any bands that might have done the raven. Well, that was fun. I hope you enjoyed a little biographical sketch of Edgar Allan Poe. So the next time we read him, you will see that he's not as mad as you think, and that the crazy, out of control man with inner demons writing scary stories and poetry, it was an act. Something to think about. Hope you enjoyed it. As always, you had a lot of choices. Alan Parsons Project did a song called The Raven. Now, Thea, I'm going to have to look that up before I retire for the night. It's awesome. Well, you had a lot of choices, but you chose to spend a few minutes with me, and for that I am thankful. And as I've been saying every night for the past couple of weeks, read to people that you love. Good night, everyone.